This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Robert Browning by G.K. Chesterton. Section 22, Chapter 8, The Philosophy of Browning, Part 1. The great fault of most of the appreciation of Browning lies in the fact that it conceives the moral and artistic value of his work to lie in what is called the message of Browning, or the teaching of Browning, or, in other words, in the mere opinions of Browning. Now, Browning had opinions, just as he had a dress suit or a vote for Parliament. He did not hesitate to express these opinions any more than he would have hesitated to fire off a gun or open an umbrella if he had possessed those articles and realized their value. For example, he had, as his students and eulogists have constantly stated, certain definite opinions about the spiritual function of love, or the intellectual basis of Christianity. Those opinions were very striking and very solid, as everything was which came out of Browning's mind. His two great theories of the universe may be expressed in two comparatively parallel phrases. The first was what may be called the hope which lies in the imperfection of man. The characteristic poem of Old Pictures in Florence expresses very quaintly and beautifully the idea that some hope may always be based on deficiency itself. In other words, that in so far as a man is a one-legged or a one-eyed creature, there is something about his appearance which indicates that he should have another leg or another eye. The poem suggests admirably that such a sense of incompleteness may easily be a great advance upon a sense of completeness, that the part may easily and obviously be greater than the whole. And from this Browning draws, as he is fully justified in drawing, a definite hope for immortality and the large scale of life. For nothing is more certain than that, though this world is the only world that we have known, or of which we could even dream, the fact does remain that we have named it a strange world. In other words, we have certainly felt that this world did not explain itself, that something in its complete and patent picture has been omitted. And Browning was right in saying that in a cosmos where incompleteness implies completeness, life implies immortality. This, then, was the first of the doctrines or opinions of Browning, the hope that lies in the imperfection of man. The second of the great Browning doctrines requires some audacity to express. It can only be properly stated as the hope that lies in the imperfection of God. That is to say, that Browning held that sorrow and self-denial, if they were the burdens of man, were also his privileges. He held that these stubborn sorrows and obscure valours might, to use a yet more strange expression, have provoked the envy of the Almighty. If man has self-sacrifice and God has none, then man has in the universe a secret and blasphemous superiority. And this tremendous story of a divine jealousy Browning reads into the story of the crucifixion. If the Creator had not been crucified, he would not have been as great as thousands of wretched fanatics among his own creatures. It is needless to insist upon this point. Any one who wishes to read it splendidly expressed need only be referred to Saul. But these are emphatically the two main doctrines or opinions of Browning, which I have ventured to characterise roughly as the hope of the imperfection of man, and more boldly as the hope in the imperfection of God. They are great thoughts, thoughts written by a great man, and they raise noble and beautiful doubts on behalf of faith, which the human spirit will never answer or exhaust. But about them, in connection with Browning, there nevertheless remains something to be added. Browning was, as most of his upholders and all his opponents say, an optimist. His theory that man's sense of his own imperfection implies a design of perfection is a very good argument for optimism. His theory that man's knowledge of and desire for self-sacrifice implies God's knowledge of and desire for self-sacrifice is another very good argument for optimism. But any one will make the deepest and blackest and most incurable mistake about Browning who imagines that his optimism was founded on any arguments for optimism. Because he had a strong intellect, because he had a strong power of conviction, he conceived and developed and asserted these doctrines of the incompleteness of man and the sacrifice of omnipotence. But these doctrines were the symptoms of his optimism, they were not its origin. It is surely obvious that no one can be argued into optimism, since no one can be argued into happiness. Browning's optimism was not founded on opinions which were the work of Browning, but on the life which was the work of God. One of Browning's most celebrated biographers has said that something of Browning's theology must be put down to his possession of a good digestion. The remark was, of course, like all remarks touching the tragic subject of digestion, intended to be funny and to convey some kind of doubt or diminution touching on the value of Browning's faith. But if we examine the matter with somewhat greater care, we shall see that it is indeed a thorough compliment to that faith. Nobody, strictly speaking, is happier on account of his digestion. He is happy because he is so constituted as to forget all about it. Nobody really is convulsed with delight at the thought of the ingenious machinery which he possesses inside him. The thing which delights him is simply the full possession of his own human body. I cannot in the least understand why a good digestion, that is, a good body, should not be held to be as mystic a benefit as a sunset or the first flower of spring. But there is about digestion this peculiarity, throwing a great light on human pessimism, that it is one of the many things which we never speak of as existing until they go wrong. We should think it ridiculous to speak of a man as suffering from his boots if we meant that he really had no boots. But we do speak of a man suffering from digestion when we mean that he suffers from a lack of digestion. In the same way we speak of a man suffering from nerves when we mean that his nerves are more inefficient than anyone else's nerves. If anyone wishes to see how grossly language can degenerate, he need only compare the old optimistic use of the word nervous, which we employ in speaking of a nervous grip, with the new pessimistic use of the word which we employ in speaking of a nervous manner. And as digestion is a good thing which sometimes goes wrong, as nerves are good things which sometimes go wrong, so existence itself in the eyes of Browning and all the great optimists is a good thing which sometimes goes wrong. He held himself as free to draw his inspiration from the gift of good health as from the gift of learning or the gift of fellowship. But he held that such gifts were in life innumerable and varied, and that every man, or at least almost every man, possessed some window looking out on this essential excellence of things. Browning's optimism, then, since we must continue to use this somewhat inadequate word, was a result of experience. Experience which is, for some mysterious reason, generally understood in the sense of sad or disillusioning experience. An old gentleman rebuking a little boy for eating apples in a tree is in the common conception of the type of experience. If he really wished to be a type of experience, he would climb up the tree himself and proceed to experience the apples. Browning's faith was founded upon joyful experience, not in the sense that he selected his joyful experiences and ignored his painful ones, but in the sense that his joyful experiences selected themselves and stood out in his memory by virtue of their own extraordinary intensity of colour. He did not use experience in that mean and pompous sense in which it is used by the worldling advanced in years. He rather used it in that healthier and more joyful sense in which it is used at revivalist meetings. In the Salvation Army, a man's experiences mean his experience of the mercy of God, and to Browning the meaning was much the same. But the revivalists' confessions deal mostly with the experiences of prayer and praise. Browning's dealt preeminently with what may be called his own subject, the experiences of love. And this quality of Browning's optimism, the quality of detail, is also a very typical quality. Browning's optimism is that of the ultimate and unshakable order that is founded upon the absolute sight and sound and smell and handling of things. if a man had gone up to Browning and asked him, with all the solemnity of the eccentric, "Do you think life is worth living?" it is interesting to conjecture what his answer might have been. If he had been for the moment under the influence of the orthodox rationalistic deism of the theologian, he would have said, "Existence is justified by its manifest design, its manifest adaptation of means to ends," or, in other words, existence is justified by its completeness. If, on the other hand, he had been influenced by his own serious intellectual theories, he would have said, existence is justified by its air of growth and doubtfulness, or, in other words, existence is justified by its incompleteness. But if he had not been influenced in his answer either by the accepted opinions or by his own opinions, but had simply answered the question, "Is life worth living?" with the real vital answer that awaited it in his own soul, he would have said, as likely as not, "Crimson toadstools in Hampshire." Some plain, glowing picture of this sort left on his mind would be his real verdict on what the universe had meant to him. To his traditions hope was traced to order, to his speculations hope was traced to disorder, but to Browning himself hope was traced to something like red toadstools. His mysticism was not of that idle and wordy type which believes that a flower is symbolical of life. It was rather that of a deep and eternal type which believes that life, a mere abstraction, is symbolical of a flower. With him the great concrete experiences which God made always come first, his own deductions and speculations about them always second, and in this point we find the real peculiar inspiration of his very original poems. One of the very few critics who seem to have got near to the actual secret of Browning's optimism is Mr. Santayana in his most interesting book, Interpretations of Poetry and Religion. He, in contradistinction to the vast mass of Browning's admirers, had discovered what was the real root of virtue of Browning's poetry, and the curious thing is that, having discovered that root virtue, he thinks it is a vice. He describes the poetry of Browning most truly as the poetry of barbarism, by which he means the poetry which utters the primeval and indivisible emotions. For the barbarian is the man who regards his passions as their own excuse for being, who does not domesticate them either by understanding their cause or by conceiving their ideal goal. Whether this be or be not a good definition of the barbarian, it is an excellent and perfect definition of the poet. It might perhaps be suggested that barbarians, as a matter of fact, are generally highly traditional and respectable persons who would not put a feather wrong in their headgear, and who generally have very few feelings and think very little about those that they have. It is when we have grown to a greater and more civilized stature that we begin to realize and put to ourselves intellectually the great feelings that sleep in the depths of us. Thus it is that the literature of our day has steadily advanced toward a passionate simplicity, and we become more primeval as the world grows older, until Whitman writes huge and chaotic psalms to express the sensations of a schoolboy out fishing, and Maeterlinck embodies in symbolic dramas the feelings of a child in the dark. Thus Mr. Santayana is perhaps the most valuable of all the Browning critics. He has gone out of his way to endeavour to realise what it is that repels him in Browning, and he has discovered the fault which none of Browning's opponents have discovered. And in this he has discovered the merit which none of Browning's admirers have discovered. Whether the quality be a good or a bad quality, Mr. Santayana is perfectly right. The whole of Browning's poetry does rest upon primitive feeling, and the only comment to be added is that so does the whole of everyone else's poetry. Poetry deals entirely with those great, eternal, and mainly forgotten wishes which are the ultimate despots of existence. Poetry presents things as they are to our emotions, not as they are to any theory, however plausible, or any argument, however conclusive. If love is in truth a glorious vision, poetry will say that it is a glorious vision, and no philosophers will persuade poetry to say that it is the exaggeration of the instinct of sex. If bereavement is a bitter and continually aching thing, poetry will say that it is so, and no philosophers will persuade poetry to say that it is an evolutionary stage of great biological value. And here comes in the whole value and object of poetry, that it is perpetually challenging all systems with the test of a terrible sincerity. The practical value of poetry is that it is realistic upon a point upon which nothing else can be realistic, the point of the actual desires of man. Ethics is the science of actions, but poetry is the science of motives. Some actions are ugly, and therefore some parts of ethics are ugly. But all motives are beautiful, or present themselves for the moment as beautiful, and therefore all poetry is beautiful. If poetry deals with the basest matter, with the shedding of blood for gold, it ought to suggest the gold as well as the blood. Only poetry can realise motives, because motives are all pictures of happiness. And the supreme and most practical value of poetry is this, that in poetry, as in music, a note is struck which expresses beyond the power of rational statement a condition of mind, and all actions arise from a condition of mind. Prose can only use a large and clumsy notation. It can only say that a man is miserable or that a man is happy. It is forced to ignore that there are a million diverse kinds of misery and a million diverse kinds of happiness. Poetry alone, with the first throb of its metre, can tell us whether the depression is the kind of depression that drives a man to suicide, or the kind of depression that drives him to the Tivoli. Poetry can tell us whether the happiness is the happiness that sends a man to a restaurant, or the much richer and fuller happiness that sends him to church. End of section 22.